Budget season is upon us, and to help you make decisions in any feedback to the board or the government, we wanted to explain as simply as we can about funding and spending at Fort McMurray Public School Division. I'll walk you through an overview of the funding manual, where we get our funds from, to the division budget and where the money is allocated, and then to the school budget. I felt this was the best way to share, given that you can stop and pick up where you left off at any time. And this is a very complex subject, and it may be a lot to listen to it all at once. Please feel free to email me any questions afterward. And so today I'm doing a session called Budget 101. Essentially, the Treasury Board and the Ministry of Finance is where the money comes from, and it's given to the Ministry of Education. They then have created a method to do this, considering the needs as a province in their business plans. And these are then mandated to the Premier, to the Minister of Education through the business plan. What you're seeing in front of you is a chart for the February budget from last year and the announcement from the Government of Alberta. You can see how they break down the funding to different categories, and they're broken down further, but in the chart you can get an overall idea of how they determine where the money will go. Then this again would be based on what they've determined along with the Education Ministry as the needs likely based on student population in order to meet their goals in the Ministry of Education. So up in the left corner, you see I've circled the words thousands of dollars, and that's just so that you get a better understanding, because if you go across the top line where it says Ministry Support Services, for the current year, which I've circled, it says $6,598. So you need to add thousands of dollars on the end of that. So it's $6,598,000. And another way of saying that is $6.5 million. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. And so those are the different categories. And I did put a star in there because I have a question myself to the ministry, which I'm waiting for an answer for, to get further clarification on what that line includes. And so when I know that, I will share that with you. And so that money on that chart is then divided up to school divisions through a very complex method. They provide school divisions with the funding manual, which is what you see a picture of here in front of you. And I've gone through it to try and demonstrate some of that complexity for you, but in a simple way. It's basically based on formulas and funding rates, criteria, and reporting requirements. And I'm going to explain as best I can without boring you. If you have questions, please feel free to send them to me via email, and I'll try to get them answered as quickly as I can. This manual is available online for you as well. So if you wanted to, you could just Google it. But when you're Googling it, make sure you put the year so that you get the right information. So I would just Google 2024-25 Alberta Funding Manual, and it would probably pop up, no problem. Okay, are you ready? Fasten your seatbelts. It's a very interesting ride. So the ministry now takes the funding given within each piece of the big pie that it has, and it decides how it's going to further split up the pie. As you can see, there are 15 major grant allocations in blue here, and they are all contained within 5 pots of money. The first pot being base instruction, and then supports and services, school, community, and jurisdiction. And I'll break those all down for you so you understand them better. So they're all coming from that piece of pie that the government has shared, except for the $408 million, which is set aside for private and preschools, unfortunately. That amount is up 13% overall compared to public education, which is kind of disappointing, but we take what we get and we do the best that we can with it. So nothing is simple. It's very complex calculations in my opinion, but I'm going to do my best to explain it to you. And I will also be sharing what the division allocations look like and how the schools budget. And this budget that we get, the amount of money that we get, is adjusted after March. So in March of the current year, we will look at where we sit, and the government will either owe us money because our enrollment has increased, and or we might owe them money if our enrollment has decreased. So our first big pot of money is the base instruction, and that includes kindergarten, grades 1 to 9, and high school. And they're all funded a little bit differently, but this is called the base instruction grant, and it is actually up 1.1% this year. It's not a lot. In previous years, the increase was higher, but you can see in front of you that the government does not use a model that allocates funding per student. Instead, it uses an average enrollment to allocate the funding for educational activities of the entire division. So they look at the average enrollment and they attach a dollar figure based on that average enrollment. Now, this is important because it's only been taking place since 2020, 2021. This is a newer funding model, and we're not being funded like we used to be. But also, the funding that we are getting is never fully funding us for the number of students we currently have in our schools. And I'm going to explain that a little bit further in a minute. If you recall nothing at all from this session, I hope that you remember me saying that this funding model doesn't work, particularly for school divisions who are growing. And we have only been growing since 2017-18, with the exception of 2020, which was during COVID. This means that our unfunded students, we have had unfunded students every year since 2017-18. And so it's a challenge. There is an X through one of the pots, and that's because it's for rural schools, which we don't qualify for. We are an urban school. So I just wanted to share that with you. So this kind of explains the weighted moving average. Whenever you hear someone talking about the weighted moving average, that is the current funding model. And this is the funding model that's not working for growing school divisions. It was put in place to help create predictable funding, which it does. It helps boards so they don't have to keep adjusting revenue forecasts. It also claims that it has reduced the red tape because there's less grant funding. So there used to be 36 grants, and now there's 15. So it's cut down a lot of red tape. However, I cannot stress this enough, it does not meet the needs of growing school divisions. So they average it out over 3 years, as you can see in the chart. So for this school year, we would have received, based on 2 years ago, in 22-23, we would look at how many students we had, and they would multiply that by 20%. So the next year they would multiply by 30, and then for this year it would be 50. And I'm going to show you a little example so you can understand that a little bit better. So if you look at the bottom green box, in 22-23, we had 6,982 students. So if you follow their formula and you multiply that by 20%, you get 1,396 students. For the following year, 23-24, we had 7,514 students. If you multiply that by 30%, you get 2,254. And then finally, the projection, which means what we're guessing we might have, because the budget is decided before the school year starts. So we projected 7,911 students. And if you multiply that by 50%, you get 3,956. After they do all the calculating and we get the actual enrollment and we find out that we actually did have 7,911 students, when you look at the weighted moving average, the total students that are going to be funded is 7,606. And so that's 305 students who are not funded. And that is a lot of money. That's in the millions. Yes, there are other ways that they say they make up for it, but I'm going to explain a little bit about how that doesn't necessarily work either. So one grant that we get is the Supplemental Enrollment Growth Grant, and this provides additional per student funding for the enrollment growth based on either the incremental growth, which is the first formula you see, or the enrollment thresholds, which is the second, whichever is greater. And so depending on how much growth you've had, if you look in the bottom box, depending on how much growth you've had, that will say how much more funding you're going to get. So it's not necessarily per student. And if you look in the far right in the box, we did receive 1.4 million funding for growth in enrollment of 397 students. But had these students been fully funded like they were in the past, we would have received almost another $1 million. And so there's still a bit of a gap. A second pot of money that we have is for supports and services. And you can see there are 5 different areas that we get supports in this pot of money from. And so we can't move this money to different pots. We have to do, it's called targeted funding. And so we have to spend the money in the areas that the government tells us. So the supports and services grant helps with multiple areas. There's a lot of words on this page. I'll try and explain it really quick. The first area is the specialized learning support in blue, and that's for all students in grades kindergarten to grade 12. The supports and services grants helps provide additional funding for the entire division to provide a continuum of supports and services to children who require any kind of support for inclusive learning. And we are responsible as a division for ensuring that the funding is dispersed based on needs related to the supports that are required for this learning. And so we have to look at our local context, and we have a method to do that I will explain a little bit later. So they give us a pot of money and they say, here, use this with your special needs students. They don't know the needs. They have a formula that they use. They also will look at the jurisdiction composition. So to address the diverse needs of the classrooms among the jurisdictions, they look at the immigrant population, the percentage of students with disabilities, so those receiving FCSD support, and they do a little calculation with that. As well, we have the student wellness program as part of this pot of money. And so they support the capacity in the school authority to offer wellness supports to improve educational outcomes for all of the students. Now, a reminder that these dollar amounts are not per student. They are a flat rate, so we have to assess the needs and allocate accordingly. And as I said, I'll explain that a little more later. This also includes the PUF moderate language delays, and how they're funded. So those are flat rates for both kindergarten grants. The weighted moving average of kindergarten students that are identified multiplied by 16,000. I also want to point out that what we get funded for a student in kindergarten, for example, because you have the dollar amount right in front of you, does not equal the salary of an educational assistant. The average educational assistant cost is about $50,000, which includes their benefits and cost of living allowance. And student funding is not $50,000 per student. So a student can't be funded either for multiple categories. Maybe they are English as an acquired language, English is their second language, and maybe they have a disability. The government will only look at one of those. So we usually choose the disability because I believe the funding is slightly higher. So we cluster where we have to for those with less severe disabilities because we have to prioritize the needs, which I will continue to explain in future slides. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, there are 3 different ways that we get money to support students, to support truth and reconciliation learning in the schools. And the formulas are there in front of you. I just want you to know that we get a certain amount of money that we have to spend for this purpose. It's another one of the targeted grants. The next pot of funding is for the school. They call it the school, but it's not necessarily at the school budget level. Okay, this is still the district level. They give us money for operations and maintenance and transportation. There has been no change in these grant dollars this year. And in fact, transportation is doing quite well now that they have adjusted things because of the distance that they are using as criteria for getting on the bus. Because of that change in criteria, it has increased the number of funded students. And so we aren't running a deficit anymore in that area. So that was a good news story when they changed that. 3 other grants that we get in the community pot. One is called the socioeconomic status. So this is based on a number of factors multiplied by an index. Basically, they're looking at the mother's education, lone parent households, what does homeownership look like, how many people own their homes, what's the average income in the area. They take all of these things into consideration and create this factor. Of course, we are in a higher economic area, and so we aren't as bad off as some other places in the province, but we still get some grant money here. The geographic grant is provided to us because we live north of the 55th parallel, and that is one of the criteria for that. And then the nutrition grant is almost $200,000, and this year we got a $500 increase in that grant. We also get the cost of living allowance for Fort McMurray, which is only a cost of living allowance for Fort McMurray. It's nowhere else in the province, and that's about $1,040 per month for employees. The system administration grant is another targeted grant. It's based on our current year's operation funding, and it includes board governance, which includes all activities related to the work and the operation of the elected Board of Trustees, as well as the Superintendent's office, the Business and Finance Superintendent's offices, and the Human Resources offices. So there's a number of staff here and the Board of Trustees. And this includes funding for anything from salaries to benefits, to allowances to attend provincial meetings, and any professional learning will be included in that. All right. There are some other extra grants that we do get for home education. We don't have that many home education students. We have about, I'd say, less than 10, maybe around 5. And then we have an outreach program grant for Frank Spraggins, and we get a federal French grant of $94,000 for Dickinsfield and McTavish to support their French programming. One of the newer grants, I believe it started last year, is the Classroom Complexity Grant. And it's provided to school authorities so they can address classroom complexity by adding more staff. And that can be additional EAs, or you can increase the hours of the current EAs. You might look at hiring more teachers or some specialists like interpreters or psychologists, for example. And so this year we received $485,000, and we hired approximately 10 EAs for that amount of money. 80% of the money is for the front line, and 20% of the money is for training. And then there were additional grants, which I have in the box on the right. So to address the increased cost of fuel, we get a grant for that. For the new curriculum that comes out, we have money for resources, whether that's training or actual paper resources. We have the learning disruption and low incidence grants. Low incidence is special needs students with needs that are not very common. So maybe visual impairment or hard of hearing. We have the mental health pilot grant, which ends this year, which we received over 2 years in partnership with the Catholic Division. We have the teacher salary settlement. So they settled their salaries, and we were given $1.6 million to cover the cost of that. We do not get the same thing for CUPE staff. We only get that for teaching staff. And then the school council engagement grant, which means the school councils get about $500 a year, which they can use for any kind of learning for the school council and or school events. And some school councils have not spent that money for a couple of years, so they have a little extra cash to be able to do those kinds of things. And so now I am going to move on to where does this funding go? We know where we're told to put it. That has been the whole front matter that I just talked about. Now, how do we spend it? So this shows you where the Board of Trustees makes fiscally responsive decisions on where the money goes. And if you just look at this chart, you can see the purplish blue color there. And I want to point this out because that is where that represents all the money we get from Alberta Education is the purple. The green would be other revenue. And when you see amortization, that is just a way that we have in our system to record the declining value of a fixed asset that we might have, like a school building. So I'm just going to focus on the Alberta education for now. And so those first three columns, schools, student services, and pooled, are all about the instruction piece and the teaching and learning we do with the students. Again, this pie or this wheel shows you the different areas that we have to spend our money on, that we are given money from to spend on certain things. So it's called targeted revenue. They say, here's some money, this is what you have to spend it on. So it can be anything from facilities to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, to cost of living allowance, to the basic education or administration. There's a whole list there. Lots of them are acronyms. If you need any help with those, I can definitely walk you through those. Or you might be able to see them in the funding manual as well. So when we put forth our budget, this is from last spring's budget, to just demonstrate to you what it looks like when we go into a budget to the board and get it approved. And so I've highlighted at the top the different categories: instruction, operations and maintenance, transportation and system administration, so that you can see how they're broken down in that column. And then under total revenues on the far right, I have circled 113 million, almost 114 million. That is how much money we get coming in. And then down at the bottom are total expenses. Again, it's all broken down there for you. The bulk of it is salaries, and we have to follow collective agreements for salaries. And so our expenses were projected at 121 million. And so we are slightly over and operating in a deficit of 6.4 million was our predictions for this school year. And so we will find out at the end of the school year how well we did. This is how we allocate the expenses by function. So you can see the largest chunk goes to instruction. That's our teachers. Then we have operations and maintenance as the next biggest chunk. That's getting the schools up and running and make sure everything's safe for the students and they have the infrastructure that they need. Amortization, again, is just a line that we put in to be able to show the declining value of our buildings. And then transportation and system administration. And I'm going to break those down further for you now. So in schools, in that category, again, you can see the largest chunk of money is spent on salaries and benefits. There is a total of $51.7 million is put into this pocket. It also includes some services and some supplies, materials, and equipment. And then we have something called SGF, and that is only at the school level, because what that is schools may be renting out their gym or some classrooms, and so they have some extra funds that they bring into their school that the principal can then determine, where are we going to use that money? Is it and it has to be used for the students. It can't be used for anything other than the students. It's for their benefit. And so they determine where they're going to spend that money. The next category is student services. And so you can see 18.5 million for student services. Most, again, is for salary and benefits, and that includes educational assistance. And then we have some services. So let me break that out even further for you. Student services includes the inclusive education department, where there are a number of centralized services. And this also includes the ECDP and kindergarten programming. So that's all together, bundled together. Most of the EAs are paid through this in a centralized budget. We have some professional and contracted services as well. Things like the doctor that comes to visit with families, the audiologist, the speech path and occupational therapists, some office administration that we have. Our division programs are included here, so staffing of teachers for those programs. Professional development, for example, some educational assistants take the nonviolent crisis intervention course, so that's paid for out of this pocket. And then there's other supplies and materials like iPads and sit-fits and licenses for tablets and such that would come out of this department. And so I always get asked the question, why doesn't my child have an EA? And so this is how we determine who gets an EA. Because as I said, inclusive education is allocated to us as targeted spending, and through the formula that they have determined, they give us the funding. It's not determined through coding. Okay, so it's not per student. There's no magic formula for each type of special need a student might have, and so that's why you can see it would be very difficult for them, knowing the broad range of disabilities that there are, and then the needs would be very broad as well. So we distribute the funding that we receive based on the needs of students in the schools. The school authorities know their students best is what we're told by the government, and then the school authority says the schools know their students best. So what we have developed is a process to determine what are the needs of each of the students in your school. And when that's completed by the team at the school, then they meet with the director of inclusive ed, and she takes all that information. She talks to the school about it. They have conferencing, and then she meets and comes to a consensus on all of the needs, and then she determines where the funding goes. So here's an example of the 8 domains that they look at when they're determining the needs. And so they look, there's 8 here, and under each of those categories are subcategories. And so they're kind of giving them a score of 1, 2, or 3. 1 being mild, 2 being moderate, 3 being complex. And so for each of those domains, they give it a score. And then the director of inclusive learning will look at those scores and determine support in that way. The support levels may change, the needs may change throughout the year, and so they do shuffling throughout the year. But at the start of the year, this is how we determine the educational assistance that we're going to need. On average, I already said an educational assistant costs about $49,000 when we include their benefits and cost of living allowance. And so we don't have enough money to give everybody a one-on-one EA, and they don't all need a one-on-one EA. We're trying to develop independence in some of these students as they move through their school years. This chart shows you from year to year how things have changed. The top line shows you if you go from right to left. So starting in 2021 and then moving towards 23-24, you can see how the student population has changed in our division from 6,411 to 7,749. I know now we're at 8,100 approximately. The needs were down in 2020, 2021. That was right after COVID. And then now, like every year, they've been increasing. And last year was the biggest increase. And you can see as well how the number of EAs has increased. And it's gone up 8%, then 10%, then 24%, and 32%. So we know that things are getting more complex. There are more diagnoses. There are more complexities in children. And so we have higher needs, and we require more educational assistance. We also have some programs in our division, and that also is a centralized cost that comes out of inclusive ed. And those programs are spread out through a number of schools. For example, Dr. Clark, Christina Gordon, Composite High, all have some programs. And so the staffing for those programs comes through the central budget. I think that's all I'm going to need to tell you about those programs. We do have some extra grants that we apply for. So the government of Alberta doesn't give us all of our money. And when we can't get the money we need, we have to go looking for it. And so we're very lucky to have partners and grants that we've been able to access to pay for some of these positions that you see on the right. There are 2 Government of Alberta grants there in blue that you can see. What I can tell you is every year, the other 4 grants, like this in total is about $1.8 million. And so the other grants that the Government of Alberta is not providing funding for, we seek out each year, and we never know from year to year if that money's going to be there when we go ask for it the next time. As a matter of fact, I know that that we are going to lose one of these grants. We've already been told as of end of December it's gone. So now we have to look in our budget or make some cuts. The third column is a funny one. Funny because of the way it's named. It's called Pooled, and it's about $24 million. Again, the first 3 columns are all about instruction and helping the schools. And so again, large chunk is going towards salary. a little bit towards services and supplies, and a teeny tiny bit of amortization. So what does that mean? What is pooled? Pooled means centralized, basically. So things like salaries for the safety coordinator, who we must have according to legislation for OH&S reasons. People who, like the ladies who work in the SIS department, the student services for Power School. They are needed. We can't run the schools without them, and that's our information system for communicating with the government. We have a team of First Nations, Métis, Inuit staff who are in the pooled. We have coordinators, one for literacy, 0.5 or so for numeracy. We have some people in ed tech who help the teachers learn how to use the technology. We have directors in inclusive ed and education, as well as human resources, who assist in different areas within those departments at the schools and support the principals. And then we have the cost of living is included in this category. The Alberta Teacher Retirement Fund is in this category. Benefits and anybody who's on short-term or long-term leaves also is in this part of the budget. So, we go recruiting for teachers, it comes out of this budget. Anything to do with learning disruption comes out of this budget. Next category is system administration. I'm not going to go through operations and maintenance and transportation because nothing really changed there. Operations and maintenance is they keep the school buildings going. And transportation, I already let you know that we're not really running a deficit there anymore. So the next category is system administration, which is $3.2 million. Most of it, as you can see, is salaries and benefits with a few services. I already mentioned this includes the superintendent's office, the trustees, the human resources department, and some people in business and finance. So pays for salaries, professional development, travel to meetings, professional learning. What else am I missing? I can tell you that in these departments, we've had people come and go over the last few years, but the number of these staff have not grown in a considerable number of years. Even though we've had a growing enrollment, the numbers have either been maintained or we've cut a couple. So each year we just wait to see what happens. Are we still able to handle all of the work that we have to do down here relative to business and finance and human resources when it comes to increased student enrollment? And there will come a time in the future, I'm sure, where we're going to need more people because more students create more work for the schools, which creates more work for business and finance and human resources. So that's just the way that rolls. What else can I tell you here? I'm going to go down to the school level now. And I'm going to tell you that this is how a principal then figures out how many staff members he's going to have. Because we will look at their enrollment and we will base everything on their enrollment. And this is done through the Office of the Associate Superintendent of Business and Finance. They take the enrollment number and figure ratios for allotments to the school. So if you look in this top part where it says base funding and then down a little bit it says total base funding, regular, you can see in the yellow piece that there are 13 ECDP students at this school, 46 kindergarten, 39 grade 1, and so on. And at the end of that line, a total of 273 students. So if I looked at this sheet, I would know that this school has 273 students. But wait, when I look down below, there's also an extra 26 that aren't funded. Okay? They're not funded, and so that means I really have 299 students, but I'm only funded for 273 students. And so when we're trying to figure out how many teachers that would be, we look at the ones that we're funded for. We would not be looking at the other because we wouldn't have the money to pay for the extra teachers. So the next step the principal takes is Here's what I have. Now, these numbers don't match because this is a different example, but in this example, you can see in 2021, 22, the bodies column, that's how many students this principal has in each grade level. And then he's projecting for the next year that he might have a little bit of growth. And he's not just guesstimating. Technically, he's looking at trends from the past. How many students have I increased by in the past? So he would look at that, and that's how he is projecting. Okay, he's not just grabbing he's going to say, I think it's going to be a good year, I'm going to add 20. We don't want to do that because we don't want to have surplus staff that we have to cut because we didn't get what we projected. So this principal has projected 178 students, and that generates 6 staff members. So now the principal knows I'm only going to get 6 staff members. So now he has to think, what are my classes going to look like? And so he uses a grid like this, and he writes down how many students are in each grade level. So in ECDP he has 19, in kindergarten he has 30, 27 in grade 1. And he's going to determine on his own what those classes look like. This is a school-based decision. And sometimes it depends on the teacher who's in the grade, and sometimes it depends on the grade level. So as a former principal, I might look at this and say, yeah, I don't like the idea of a grade 3-4 combined, but there aren't enough students in grade 4. There's only 10 in grade 4, so I can't have a classroom of 10. I only have 6 teachers, so how am I going to do this? Let's look at that teacher. Is she going to be able to handle those 2 curricula? Yes, she is. Okay. Sometimes we want smaller numbers in the younger grades. Sometimes we want to keep those younger grades like 1 grade level. And then when we get to older, they're more independent. So it's easier for us to manage 2 grade levels. I work with the grade 4s while the grade 5s are doing something else independently, and vice versa. It's harder to do that in the younger grades, although it has been done. I used to be a grade 1-2 teacher, and you just have to train the students how to work. You spend a lot of time in the beginning of the year figuring that out with them, and then you're able to manage that. So it depends on the make of the classroom as well. And there's a number of variables to go through as a principal when you're making these decisions. We also have at the school level certain supports that are available, and this also depends on the number of students in your building. For example, a small school like Beacon Hill is not going to have the same number of supports and the same amount of supports as a Dr. Clark school, who has more than roughly 400 more students. So it will be a percentage. Generally, we look at 1 counselor for every 500 students, 1 LAC teacher for every 500 students. And then for ELL, it's 1 to 115. So there's different ratios for those supports. And so sometimes schools team up and share supports. And division office sometimes tops up those supports where a high need is present, and they determine that that's necessary. We're almost done. This is what a typical school budget would look like. So again, we would look at how many students are in the building, what kind of supplies are they going to need, how much postage are they going to need, that kind of stuff. But it's also based on their spending from the previous year. So if they weren't spending a lot on professional development, we might change that. Or if they were spending an awful lot more on postage, then we would change that. So it's just adjusted year to year with business and finance when the principals meet with the associate superintendent. So those are the budget lines for the school. And just to finish up, I wanted to share, and I'm sure some of you have seen it on social media, that the board is doing their work to advocate, knowing the complex needs that we have, the needs for mental health, and also the election coming up. Those are the 3 areas that they chose to focus on. But that doesn't mean they're not also giving feedback on other areas. So you've seen these posters out in public. This is the one with the complex needs. We know that we've had a rise of 63% in severely coded students over the last 3 years, and the funding has not kept pace. And so when we collect this data and these posters, we put them on social media, yes, but we also have more defined data packages that we send to the ministry, that we send to the MLAs, that we share with when we meet with them and or in advance of meeting with them, so that they understand what we're talking about. And education is power, and so letting them know as often as we can what's changed, what's different, how are we impacted by certain things, is not uncommon for the board to do. They are communicating with them frequently and trying to meet with them as much as possible. And they also have a platform at the provincial level through the Alberta School Boards Association, where the minister comes in and talks with them, as well as the Public School Board Association. And so coming up next year, there is an election happening. If you're interested in becoming a school trustee, I ask you to, look into things on our web. If you have questions, you can contact the superintendent's assistant. She will take care of things. She's also the recording secretary for the board, so she's quite familiar with things. And we are going to be having a couple of information sessions coming up after the new year. If you want to learn more about being a trustee, how much time commitment it is, what the homework looks like, and what committees look like and such, I encourage you to look into that. And or if you know somebody and you think they'd make a good trustee, encourage them to look into these things. We will be updating our website page about elections after the new year as well. So I thank you for joining me today. This is going to be on YouTube forever. I have done some similar sessions before, and there's probably still on YouTube from the last few years. I really just wanted to help you get a better understanding of the budget. It's complicated, I know. And if you have questions, please email me. My email is there on the screen, but I'm not that hard to find. So you can go to the web page, or you can call the office, and they will put you through, and we can chat, or we can email back and forth. So thank you very much, and please share this with your friends.